Hey there hunters, and welcome back to the Gunners Guild. Doing another thing a little bit different today in response to this tweet here, getting such mixed set of opinions and feedback. Sarah and I wanted to explain and show the differences with the Glavinus fight between Generations and World. Before I get into that though, I do want to preface this by clarifying the tweet I had made. So what I originally meant for this tweet, which was meant to stir up people because it's fun, was that I'm surprised so many people are asking for Gore and other monsters to return in Sunbreak when we know they'll have to change up the fights to compensate for player movements and new mechanics. And looking back at World's treatment of Glavinus, another fan favorite, it made me have a thought. If you like a monster and its fight, why not just go back to the game that it came from and fight it? Like, why risk them porting over the monster and making the fight worse? Like Glavinus, Teostra, Lunastra, Barioth, Deviljho, Rajang? Like, Monster Hunter is a unique franchise in that when a new game comes out, it doesn't make the old games obsolete in the slightest. People have their favorite games and go back to play the old Monster Hunter games all the time. Or they also go back and play games they haven't played before. So why do people want monsters to return anyway? We could just have more original monsters in their environments made for the game they are introduced with. Like, wouldn't that just be better? Now, of course, we can't have all new monsters every single game, but for the most part, games introduce like 10 new monsters, most of which are low rank trash that you rarely fight. And then the rest 25 are like returning monsters. Wouldn't it be better if that was flipped? Not gonna get into gaming development nonsense, but I just had that as a thought. And also, when I say the Glavinus fight was butchered in World, I don't mean like, oh my god, that's the worst fight ever, it's unplayable. Just that it felt like such a huge step down from Generations Glav, and it was very disappointing. Not that the World fight is terrible, just that it's much worse than the Generations fight. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the Glavinus fight in Generation and World to see how they compare. I do want to thank Sarah again for helping me out with this. It's easier to butt two heads together and compare movesets in two different games. Anyway, that's enough of introduction, let's talk about Glavinus. And also, we aren't going to discuss Hellblade Glavinus as we don't have anything to compare him to. So when Glavinus was introduced in Monster Hunter Generations as the flagship monster, he was quickly regarded as one of the best fights in the entire Monster Hunter franchise. It has a wide range of moves, two different change states that alter his fighting pattern, well-telegraphed attacks, and generous hitboxes and hit zones. And of course, he is brutally aggressive at times. He has a bit of a learning curve, but once you understand his mix-ups, tricks, and how to bait him, he's a lot easier to manage and a lot of fun. Glavinus had a lot of attacks that you could bait effectively, and patterns that you could learn to make the fight easier, which is one of the cornerstones of a good fight. Now, a good hunter always tries to learn the matchup as well as they can, and memorizing tells and attack patterns leads into identifying openings. Once you get those down, you do get to your well-deserved, hard-earned quest clear screen, and Glavinus at his debut had all these things in spades. As an example, knowing that he always side bites after a double bite or an enrage roar if you're on his side, lets you position to pull this move out. You can hyper armor through the bite, and with good aiming and timing, smack him square in the teeth as he's coming around. There was also the notorious tailspin attack, a slow to wind up, quick to execute, wide area ball buster. Pretty scary when you first see it, right? Luckily, you can learn about his blind spot just next to his left leg and avoid the attack entirely. No rolling necessary, just get yourself into position and watch the tail fly right over you, and it even worked on Hellblade's double tailspin. Moving on, the roar for engaging and the rage mode is also just amazing. To give some mechanical insights, roars in Gen and GU start at the monster's face and radiate outwards, not at the target's body, which sounds like a duh, but it's not the case in all Monster Hunter games. This does let you stand behind Glavinus and be able to hit his tail if it's fiery without being hit by his roar. His roar is extremely precise as well, considering that in Generations, dodging is way harder than on World, and you could still roll through his roar without any evasion skills. There's also plenty of good openings for damage on this fight, not just from his attacks, but during his state changes too when he charges his throat and sharpens his tail. Depending on his state, he can be baited into certain attacks. For example, staying in a medium distance will bait the tail flick if its tail is charged, or come in for the double bite if his throat is charged. It's a great way to bait and punish his AI, plus in both instances, you're being offered a chance to get the best hit zones regardless of his state, with the molten tail and throat proccing weakness exploit. Glavinus' AI overall was very, very impressive. While most monsters at the time have to do head turns to reposition to face the player, Glavinus had a lot of side hops, back hops, and the tail spin turn attack to reposition without the stale head turn that other monsters have, which does make him feel like a much more natural and flowing fight. One of the other great tricks was that when he would throw out a fireball in front of the player, depending on the player's position when it exploded, he would change his attacks. If the explosion was between the player and Glav, obscuring your vision, Glav would go for the jump tail slam to catch a player off guard. As the smoke cleared, you would see him come crashing down with his tail. If the player moved around the fireball and there was no obscuration, Glav would return to his normal moveset and go for his medium range attacks such as the double bite or the tail flick. His fight was such a good give and take between the player and the monster, especially for the time before the AI rework that Worlds gave monsters. It was definitely one of the more advanced fights out there. His gear also notoriously good in Generations, forcing most hunters to fight Glavinus over and over again. Pretty much all of his melee weapons were best in slot, and while the armor wasn't the best, it was still very solid. Both its weapons and armors are very fashionable as well. So the combination of amazing and stylish gear, a great fight, and being the flagship monster for the game made it easy to see why the monster was so popular. So popular in fact that he would be reintroduced in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. So Iceborne, let's not beat around the bush. Iceborne did a lot of monsters wrong. The game had a great roster and there's tons of praise for the game, but the one thing they did wrong was the clutch claw and designing the monsters around that. So let's talk about the changes Glavinus had in Iceborne that was at fault of the Iceborne design, not so much the fault of the monsters design. Getting the more obvious out of the way, Glavinus' hit zones underwent a lot of changes, mostly due to having to balance the game around the clutch claw. Depending on your weapon of choice, this was either an annoyance or just awful, or you didn't really care. But let's tackle these both as a gunner and a blade master. From the blade master perspective, most of the hit zones are actually fine, which is why most of the player base is fine with them. While the hit zones were overall lower, not by too much, and the face was still exploitable, Blade Masters also gained the ability to make the legs exploitable with a clutch claw for easy topples, and the back dorsal fins became better hit zones for free. So I understand why there's not much of an issue here. The bigger issue here was that Ice added the neck hit zone to Glavinus, which was a very bad hit zone for everybody. While the throat is a nice and juicy hit zone in both Gen and World, it made the neck a prime target, but World's addition to a neck hit zone split the throat hit zone and the neck, so it's much smaller and harder to hit, and players would often hit the neck rather than the throat. While you have the face tenderized, it wasn't an issue, as it would still be a juicy spot, but if the tenderize ever fell off during a throat charge, the player would potentially miss out on damage if they hit the neck rather than the throat, and would have to stop their fight to re-tenderize the face before going for the throat pop again. On the gunner side of things, oh god, it's all over the place. Starting with the head hit zone was obliterated, from 50 in Gen to 30 in World before tenderizing. This forced gunners to keep the face tenderized, which was annoying for such thing as the light bowgun, who required 2 claggers to get at it, and heavy bowgun, who honestly could actually run out of time if you were using a Wyvern Heart heavy bowgun and would just get knocked off before finishing the tenderize. And honestly, gunners couldn't do anything to the head unless it was tenderized. What's worse is that even when tenderized, the neck was still not exploitable, so trying to hit the throat when it was charged was a crapshoot since World's moonshots were so common and projectiles went all over the place. A lot of shots ended up getting into the neck and not the throat. On the plus side though, the throat wasn't a good option in Generations, so it was going to be a boon in World and just ended up being like, a net zero. Now back to the dorsal fins, these were a great hit zone in Generation, and one of the main ways to deal with Glav as a gunner was pierce or water pierces from the face through the dorsal fin or from the back tail to the dorsal fins. In World though, the dorsal was gutted and is no longer exploitable unless the chest was tenderized. This left gunners in an awkward position. You could either tenderize the chest to get the dorsal fins usable for pierce and elemental ammo, but in that case you aren't dealing any damage to the face for the throat pops. Or you could tenderize the face for the throat pops, but then you're forced to play something like spread ammo or bows. And look, I'm not here to bitch about the hit zones regardless, it's just a numbers thing. It doesn't make the fight any or more or less difficult, it's just more of an annoyance thing than anything. They made the fight unnecessarily annoying, and something that was caused by Iceborne's clutch claw more than the actual, design of the monster fight.
But besides the clutch claw, World in general tweaked the AI of monsters quite a bit, and Glavinus was not immune. One of the most notorious things that was added was the infamous Brute Wyvern Roar. Now all Brute Wyverns in World have an instant roar the moment that they notice you. If you're not running earplugs, it's extremely difficult to roll through consistently, owing to very little wind up and no real tail aside from a slight change in stance, to the point where you may actually still be finishing your first attack animation whilst that roar happens with no chance to evade. This also ruined your opportunity to clutch claw the monster right from the beginning, as was typical of a lot of Iceborne speedruns. Clutch on, triple slaps, start the fight in enraged. and this would put you on the back foot. Now, compared to the Generations roar that was the normal wind-up roar, it was just another annoying change. Plus, it kinda took away from Glav's personality a bit. The scraping of the tail, adding the blade sharpening effect to its roar sound, just doesn't exist when you start off the fight. And it doesn't really change anything about combat, but it does leave the guy feeling a little bit flat and lifeless. Now, the AI also messed with some of the patterns of Glavinus. It's much more difficult to bait anything from him now, including the double bite and side bites. It also changed the charge up mechanics significantly so that instead of charging up the tail and the throat separately, both of these were done at the same time. Now, this sounds great in paper, forcing the hunter to interact with both the flaming tail and the throat with good hit zones and the chance to get a stagger, brilliant. But in normal fights, in the experience I've had in testing this rarely happens. You don't see this tail sharpening into throat heating animation. Most oftenly, I would see it after the first rage mode was dispelled. If you compare this with Generation Ultimate Glavinus, where he would often start the fight heating up his throat, it's a world of difference. So yes, on paper, doubling up on the two mechanics forces the player to engage aggressively with both of them. Brilliant. But the end result was that not only did this rarely happen, when it did, Glavinus would rarely use his fireballs, since the AI would prioritize the tail attacks instead. Now, if you go for the throat, you get the pop. Remember, this tail is still charged. So again, going back to those tail attacks, you'd rarely see this mix-up. You didn't get the sensation from Iceborne Glavinus that it was really a master of every aspect of combat. It wasn't mixing up its bite attacks with its tail attacks with its fireballs and so on. It just felt like something with a big tail that was smashing it down on you. And call me biased, but I'd just go fight Duramboros if I wanted that. So with the fight itself losing a fair bit of its luster, and you'd see a lot of repeating attacks, rather than all of this switching up and using every tool available to him. Now, don't get me wrong, Glavinus as its base kit is an excellent monster. It is a good fight, it's just Generations was so much better, so much more up there that by virtue of being included in World and all of the weight of World that came down on top of it, pun probably intended, it just felt worse.
The last minor nuisance of the fight was the change to a lot of the hitboxes to his attacks. While World's hitboxes in general were fine, Glavinus got taken down a peg. A lot of his fire explosions and tail slams got a lingering hitbox that you could walk into accidentally, whereas Generations' hitboxes were extremely tight, forgiving even. Seriously, it's to the point where like base striker Lance back hops could comfortably iframe pretty much everything he does. If you want to look at this, go watch Zebraquake's runs on Hellblade and regular Glavinus. He's by far the best GU player, and you could just see how amazingly tight his hitboxes are. Zebra also has videos explaining the entire breakdown of the Hellblade fight. It's a really good watch. Part of the hitbox changes was that the left leg hug was entirely moved in World, so you can no longer stand by him during the tailspin, as the entire body now turns into a punishing zone. Instead, you are forced to iframe it or outdistance it, and look, it's not like iframing anything on World is difficult. You get like Evade Window 3 for free on every set. Plus, the iframes in general are way more generous in Monster Hunter World compared to GU, at least frame-wise. So the lesser frame rolls in GU really highlighted how clean Glavinus' hitboxes were, and kinda shows the jank way more in World. Like, if we have more iframes in World, why is stuff still hitting us with the same timing that we had in GU? The conclusion was that adding a body hitbox to tail slams like Magnum Malo just worsens the hitboxes. I'm just trying to say that from a comparison to the Generations version, it's a lot more annoying than it used to be. Glavinus being large on World by comparison is also kinda weird. Some of his tail swipes and pivot moves push him so much further away than before just due to his size, and a lot of his attacks now hit further away or clip through the grounds a lot more for the same reason. This is an extremely minor complaint as the maps, sizes, and the players are all different, so the perspective's different and it's all kinda anecdotal, but it's still something to point out. Lastly, as everyone knows, the World's weapons are a joke at times. Like, Glavinus' weapons all got butchered in the looks department. So this whole thing is like a polar opposite to Generations. Glavinus himself had a more annoying fight, he's no longer a flagship, and the equipment wasn't the best or did it even look cool. Like, it was a step down in almost every facet compared to the Generations version. That being said, it's still one of the best monsters in the entire franchise. I just don't think we need to go through this again. Forcing a monster from a prior game to work with the mechanics of a new generation can work, and we've definitely seen that with, Rise's Kushala, World's Garuga, Alatreon. But is it really necessary? As much as I would love Gormagala to return, why risk it? 4U and Generation are both amazing Monster Hunter games, and you can fight it there in its full glory. Especially if they're going to be changing the fights for newer games, wouldn't new monsters just be better? We wouldn't have to compare monsters to their old counterparts and stuff.
Besides, where the hell are the people asking for Seregios back? I want him. Give me the pine cone.
Yeah, I mean, Steve can come back. But anyway, that's all for me and Sarah. Thank you for your help again. I appreciate it, sir. And thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters. I'll see you guys in Elgato.